Good evening, welcome, and peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum. I'm very glad to welcome you all to this edition of the Public Forum. The Public Forum started off earlier this year as the live in-person strand of the In Good Faith podcast. I decided on this occasion to take the opportunity to shift it online. It still remains the public forum in the sense that we have a live audience here with us at the time of recording this conversation. We are here to discuss the question, do Muslims have a future in Britain? It's an ominous question. The reason we're having this session is because this was precipitated on Friday afternoon, the day after the elections took place, when a friend of mine called me and asked me precisely this question in all seriousness. And to be fair, it's something which in different phraseologies I've heard over and over again ever since Labour won a landslide. It's surprisingly fast how it happened straight after a Labour victory, almost immediately. The question was, when is this going to end and when is reform going to come in? So what was on everyone's minds all of a sudden just became a lot more real last Thursday. And there's lots of different factors and different elements and different components to all of that story that we want to try and unpack with our two esteemed guests, Jacob Williams and Mustafa Warsi, both from Pickthall House, a think tank. I won't get into long introductions. Those have been done. But gentlemen, welcome. If you'd like to, if I can invite you both just to unmute yourself, just so we can make sure we catch your initial responses. But look, what I'm going to do just for everybody's, just as a reminder to everybody is I'm going to pose some questions to Jacob and Mustafa for around 45 minutes or so. And then up to 45 minutes, we'll invite your questions. You'll be able to ask questions either written or you'll be able to raise your hand. I can bring you in on audio, not video. So if you are in your pajamas and lying in bed, don't worry, you can still ask your question that way with no one knowing what's going on. Okay, great. I would like to actually just begin by getting you both to actually just answer the question, maybe just with an opening response or so. So maybe Jacob, will start with yourself. Do Muslims have a future in Britain?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us on, Iqbal. It's a great pleasure to be here. So the simple answer is yes. And the more developed answer is that we have to look at this election result in the context of dysfunctions that have really been growing in Britain for several years and to a large extent over the last 20 years. So the first thing we would say is that, of course, there are malicious, dangerous groups who are trying to weaponize sentiment against Muslims. We all know this is happening. We know there are dangerous organizations like Quilliam who've done immense damage to the Muslim community and stirred up unnecessary hatred, and it quite understandably creates a lot of fear. The other side of this equation, though, is that there are also very legitimate worries and grievances, some of which have been manipulated, but some of which are grounded in reality, not just about the behavior of a minority of Muslims, also about the wider economic and political situation, the collapse of living standards, and the problems around integration and very rapid immigration, especially over the last 7 or 8 years since the so-called Boris wave during Boris Johnson's government. So what we're seeing now is a backlash against these trends. It's a trend towards reform that understandably a lot of us are concerned about. My take from having spoken to people inside reform, including Muslims in reform, like Zia Yusuf, who of course is a prominent Muslim inside the party, is that reform isn't per se about hating on all Muslims just because they're Muslim, or one of their most prominent leaders wouldn't be a Muslim. It's rather about, as I said, a kind of backlash against real problems. There are many, many issues with some of the rhetoric being used, but I don't think they're going to persecute Muslims as such. I don't think the agenda is to try to push all Muslims into the sea. I think there will absolutely be room for a healthy civic life for Muslims in Britain in the future. But what's important to know is it's not going to be the same as it has been before. It's not going to just go on with this kind of implicit, pragmatic compromise. We don't have to think things through or really examine our commitments. There's going to be a lot more pressure placed on Muslims to embrace a kind of commitment more explicitly, more directly to certain kind of, if you like, and I know it's a loaded term, but if you like, liberal values. So things like religious freedom, freedom of speech, not just as a pragmatic compromise, but in principle. There's going to be more pressure coming towards Muslim communities to, for instance, say that even in an ideal society in which Muslims were a much larger number, we wouldn't want things like restrictions on blasphemy or apostasy, even in principle. These kind of things are going to be placed towards Muslims as a form of pressure, and there's going to be an impetus to take really clear, explicit stands. That's going to be difficult for some members of the community. It's going to be much easier for others. And a lot of the future of Muslims in Britain will depend on how we navigate this new situation, which has new challenges, but I think also, as we'll discuss later on, new opportunities as well.
Cool. Thank you, Jacob. Mustafa.
So I would echo most of what Jacob has already stated, but I think I will take the opportunity to zoom out a little bit and ask the question about what the future of Britain at all looks like. And I think given the social political climate of the day, given the economic situation, given the fact that the state seems to have absolutely no capacity, that the citizenry is deeply polarized, can't seem to agree on anything, government seems weak and has in fact been weak. I mean, it's essentially since Blair. You're starting to see. I mean, it's not just a question of whether or not Muslims have a future in Britain. It's really more deeply, fundamentally, a question of whether or not Britain itself, as an entity, as it has currently existed over the last, I want to say 30, 40 years, can persist in this way. Does Britain have a future? And it's starting to dawn increasingly on everyone. Obviously, everybody's knee-jerk reaction is to think of themselves and their families and their communities and say, okay, do we have a place here? Because I can guarantee you that, as crazy as it sounds, particularly given the state of media rhetoric, and Jacob will know this, if you talk to people in disenfranchised white communities, they will say exactly the same thing. This is what leads them to start talking about, there's obviously ranges in this, right? There are people who talk about, they frame their complaint in terms of class collapse or class warfare. Yes, there's no way out because, we're being completely hollowed out by the globalist class. Or other people will say there's some kind of white replacement going on, or whatever. But essentially every sort of community, to a certain extent, to what extent this is grounded in reality is a different story. But you can find this in virtually every community in the UK, where everybody's asking themselves the question of what is the future of our people here. And so you're starting to recognize, and we are no different. There's not only would I say, is there nothing wrong? It is completely correct to have it's a sign of having your finger on the pulse to ask this question at all, because this is in fact a very pivotal time and a time of high tension where it's slowly entering the zeitgeist that the equilibrium that we've existed in for the better part of the last 30 years cannot hold. And accordingly, you will slowly start to see a kind of shift to a new political form, a new political order, a new cultural order, where everybody will have to find a new way to re-equilibrate. And the popularity of the Greens on the one hand and the popularity of reform on the other hand is simply an exemplification of this, of society trying to find a new balance. And now, in order to make the question more narrow once again, you have to ask the question, okay, well, what are the things that Muslims were doing as part of this old order that cannot persist into this new order that will be fundamentally rejected by this new order? In fact, what are the things that Muslims have been doing that can persist, that will find a home in this new equilibrium, and what won't, right? And much of this obviously depends to some extent where the equilibrium lies, right? So if for example, you take the extremal case of, you have not just reform, which for all of their bluster, I would not call. There's a lot. You can say a lot about their rhetoric, but I would not call them a racist party. But if you have people who are further right, because there exist people who are more extreme than them, more further right than them, more radical than them, if that part of the zeitgeist starts to take hold, and you start to see a kind of ascendancy in ethno-nationalistic politics in this country, then you recognize that actually there's almost nothing about the Muslim way of life that can persist neatly in this new order. But contrarily, if that's not true, if you can find a way, if Muslims can adapt in such a way that the new order allows us to preserve the aspects of our life that are most important and most vitalistic, while still accepting the need for a certain kind of evolution or a certain kind of change, then I think that's certainly absolutely true that that Muslims will have a future in Britain, and that this future might well be incredibly prosperous. But the point here is essentially that this is an incredibly delicate and incredibly pivotal time where everybody's looking for a new balance. You can to some extent, the country is asking, just as Muslims are asking the question, and again, I will posit that this is really, it's kind of hard to believe that this is true of other communities, particularly seeing the rhetoric in the media about Muslims. But I think it is true that particularly among aggrieved white working class people in this country. But
just on that, Mustafa, isn't there a difference, right? In the sense that there's a difference between, okay, to give an example, I noted with some with some what's the word? With a smile on my face, how say Muslim LinkedIn over the last year, was increasingly complaining about broken Britain
Mm,
and why now Dubai is the place to go, right? Because
mm.
Britain is over, and it's a hopeless kind of situation. And it was interesting to me just because it was kind of it was like an economic migration in once upon a time, and now it seemed like an economic migration out. Um, but the difference between surely the kind of general Muslim anxiety with regards to this question and say the white working class, it goes beyond that. Meaning for the Muslim, it's about the fact that for the white working class, it's not their whiteness or something about them ideologically that they feel is being questioned or at stake, meaning something more central to their identity. Yeah, they might not feel they have the opportunity, they might feel they're getting sidelined, etc. And in a similar-ish kind of way from a socio-economic perspective, there is the extent to which Muslims might feel also similarly sidelined in certain areas. But isn't there a difference? The difference being in the case of Muslims, like you've said, like there's a lot of that rhetoric that goes beyond simply, stigmatizing at the level of, again, ideology and identity at a much deeper level, which then creates an environment of hostility and discomfort.
No, yes, that's obviously true, right? Like that, like it's obviously true that Muslims are routinely scapegoated in the media. They're routinely scapegoated in popular discourse, in politics, in business, in a variety of different domains. So this is like not it's not a controversial fact to state that that's the case. It is the case. The question is, if we want to address it and find a new way of life here, we need to understand, one, where it comes from, and two, what the appropriate response is. And largely the claim I wanted to posit was that essentially, in a sentence, something needs to change. That if Muslims have this expectation that they can continue going on living and behaving and acting, and I really don't mean this. I mean, I don't mean this in the sense that I'm not even passing a moral judgment here. I'm not saying that we've been acting in this like horrific and really depraved way, that the people, the working class have a right to hate us. I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply stating descriptively, in the world, if you look at how things are going, whatever the status quo is cannot hold. And so if there is to be a future that is prosperous, something will have to change. And that the ideal form of that change would be a certain degree of, I mean, Jacob put it, I would say pretty well, where you will start to see an increasing pressure for a deeper level of integration, or deeper level of liberal commitment amongst Muslims that the rest of society hasn't yet had the confidence in us to be able to hold and maintain. And that's really what's happening. So it's almost as if we're asking this question in response to the question that the rest of society is posing on us, which is that if Muslims were 51% of the population, would they start beheading people for apostasy? And like it sounds a little crazy for me to say this, but for the average white guy who's voting reform, they genuinely don't know the answer to that question. They are genuinely terrified of that question. And so Muslims need to do a little bit more work here to try and because essentially what's going to happen is it's going to go one of two ways, right? You'll either have to find this kind of new liberal compromise, or the country will swing further right into a certain kind of ethno-nationalism, and that will end badly for everybody, including, I would say, natives in this country. I mean, the UK was built on a glorious foundation of multicultural and liberal politics. And I mean, when I say liberal, I don't mean modern progressive. I mean classically liberal politics for the better part of the last 500 years. And to throw that away would really mean the death of this country, which ties me back to the start of this conversation where I talked about whether or not Britain itself has a future. And so now the Muslim community is at a critical juncture where it has to figure out how best to respond. And different people will have different theological commitments. And again, I'm not passing judgment on anybody's theology. I don't want to pass judgment on anybody's, personal convictions. There's no gun that should be held to anybody's head to say that you must accept gay marriage, or you must accept abortion, or you must accept whatever the dominant cultural mores want you to accept. But that you will start to feel pressure, and that this is just inevitable. And then the question becomes, are you able to find this new compromise as a community? And if not, then the advantageous thing would be, I mean, frankly, for Muslims who cannot find this, because if they don't, then they will only risk further tipping the country towards either ethno-nationalism, or worsen their situation here. For those set of people who feel like they cannot make those commitments, it would be better for them to go and find somewhere that would be more amenable to their views.
And well, that's so interesting. I didn't
mean-
expect that you would say. I didn't expect that you would say that the motivation for emigration would be for the greater good of Britain. So
I know.
anyway. Okay,
I think it would be for the greater good of both
yeah,
Britain and for the people who.
Sure. I understand what you're getting at. Okay, but look, let's. I think we need to. I think. I'm guessing that a fair amount, or a certain, at least some of what has been said so far, whilst it's maybe highly sort of pragmatic in one sense, is also going to be tough listening, even for the people who are here with us live, right? So let's maybe explore this a bit further. Jacob, maybe you could just. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what has been mentioned so far about the kinds of challenges, or the ways in which this pressure is going to manifest potentially, that you think it's likely that it's going to manifest in particular ways, and then what kind of reasonable responses you think there are, which from your perspective sit within the broad realm of what might be considered to be internally acceptable, as well as, that's in the intersection essentially, right, of this kind of Venn diagram between, well, what the if this is even a right way to characterize, but kind of what the external world wants and what the internal world can tolerate.
Yeah. I mean, I think the right way to frame this is about mutual trust. So it's less a question of, well, whose grievances are worse? Do Muslims have it worse? Do the white working class have it worse? Do the Jewish community have it worse? Like, this is a pointless game to play in a lot of ways. It's more about, do we have mutual trust between different communities? And Mustafa, really, I think you put your finger on it there. The question a lot of people, and especially we try to imagine, and I'm not saying that this narrative is true, but it's a narrative that's become popular among sections of the white population. They kind of look at communities that have undergone this incredibly quick demographic change. They hear about things like the grooming gangs. Sometimes they feel like minorities in their own community, and they think, well, okay, if this Muslim population reached a certain level, if they gain a certain amount of power, what's going to happen? Are we still going to have the political freedoms that we have now? And thus far, the answer from Muslim organizations hasn't been sufficiently clear and unequivocal and explicit. Of course, the majority of Muslims are not trying to take away freedom from other communities. On the other hand, there are plenty of Muslim organizations who will say, well, this is a compromise. Ideally, we want to have an Islamic state, whatever that actually means, of some kind, right? We want to have laws against this and that. We want to have restrictions on personal freedom. So I think that's the direction the pressure is going to come, first of all. And this is exactly the kind of rhetoric you see. You see from Reform. You see rhetoric about Islamism. You see rhetoric about Islamization. You see talk about political Islam. What they mean by that is, well, we don't mind how you pray in your own home, in your own community. What we're worried about is the thought you're going to try to impose a particular conception of religious law upon other people, or upon people who want to change their religion. And I think that's going to be the biggest direction this comes from. It's going to be a commitment to basic, if you like, constitutional liberal freedoms as ideals, not just as compromises. And I think it's really important here to emphasize that there are really, really powerful resources inside the Islamic tradition, the theological tradition, and the legal tradition that can give us grounds to affirm these things as ideals. We can look at, scholars like Muhammad Fadl, who is he's both a scholar of Western jurisprudence and Maliki fiqh, who's done a great deal of work to explain why the best kind of political society that we should aim for is one in which we do preserve these freedoms for everyone, no matter how much of a majority or how much power Muslims gain. So I think Mustafa and I would both agree that across a huge spectrum of different interpretations of the Islamic tradition, from, if you like, the most conservative to the more, if you like, flexible, there is room to say, no, we don't want this Islamic state of any kind. No, you can trust that if we were a majority, you'd have the same freedoms you have now. And here are the reasons why. And this is the kind of thing that Muslims are going to come under more and more pressure to do, to say, to be public, to be explicit about, and not just to... We can't just rely on trust being there that this is going to happen without it being explicit, and without Muslims taking the initiative to put this stuff out there in the most forceful way.
I understand, but I mean, isn't part of the problem here that we're sort of, okay, two things. Number one, who in Britain I mean, what proportion of Muslims are even thinking on a day-to-day basis about Britain one day hopefully becoming an Islamic state? I imagine that figure is, I don't know, but I imagine that figure is extremely low. And then it's made to seem a lot bigger than in reality it actually is. And then isn't partly the concern also would be that, look, sounds a little bit like, the whole thing about you have to condemn terrorism, right? And there's some people that ultimately just got fed up of condemning terrorism all the time, because the starting supposition is almost, well, obviously you're pro-terrorism until you condemn it. The starting assumption isn't, that you have just as much of a problem with, the loss of innocent life as anybody else. And so whilst again, I can understand what you're saying, but I suppose the counter argument, the problem is that, okay, if you accept this framework that almost seems to kind of put Muslims into a second-class citizen bracket until they prove otherwise, as opposed to just a British citizens like everybody else until it's proved otherwise, so kind of innocent until proven guilty, and rather than the other way around, which, as far as I'm aware, is part of this whole classical liberalism. So, yeah, do you see that it's a fool's errand to play this game? Potentially is the counter argument.
Well, I think this is why it comes down to a question of trust. So you ask, how many Muslims are thinking about creating an Islamic state? Of course, it's a tiny number who are actively trying to do these things. But on the other hand, we look at, and we've done a lot of research at Pickthall House about this. We look at all of the surveys of Muslims. There is a significant minority that will say, yes, in theory, we would like to have an Islamic state. We would like to have laws against blasphemy, apostasy, etc., etc. That's a significant minority. Might be 20%, might be 25%, depending on how you ask the question. Now, the problem is not that minority exists. There are minorities of other communities that have worrying views as well. The problem is that it isn't countered by a sufficiently vocal and loud and explicit commitment on the other side. Now, you mentioned the analogy of condemning terrorism. Everyone who has a brain knows that the overwhelming majority of Muslims condemn terrorism and have condemned it in no uncertain terms and explicitly. But you don't have a parallel explicitness about these other things that are not terrorism, that are not direct violence, but are anti-liberal commitments, that are commitments to, like, in theory, we would take away certain basic freedoms. You don't have a parallel thing. You can look at major Muslim organizations. You don't see explicit rejection of these kind of theopolitical views. You see, frankly, usually obfuscation, obscurity about these things. There's no clarity. This is why mistrust exists. Most Muslims in politics, Muslim politicians across the political spectrum, I think already have a clear commitment to these basic freedoms. But you will see a lot of Muslim organizations, certain Darul Uloom, certain political Muslim organizations who, Mustafa might want to say more about this, but who will not be explicit, or who will say things that seem to imply the opposite, that this is only a compromise. We would take away these freedoms at some point, hypothetically. And when you see that and you don't have the explicit counter-narrative, that's why the mistrust exists. Now, we can sit here and say, oh, well, you should just trust us more anyway. Okay, of course there's bias, of course there's prejudice, of course there are actors manipulating political discourse and stirring up hatred. That's all real. But what can we do right now? What can we do with our own hands to make things better? Well, the first thing we can do is to go and actually just do what we can to build that trust. It may not work perfectly. Of course it won't work perfectly. But let's focus on what we can do to make things better rather than just wishing other people behave better.
Sure. And Mustafa, can I ask you about... Yeah, no, go on.
I was just going to add to his point, essentially, which is that while it's true that most Muslims just want to hang out, go to work, go back home, they all pay their taxes, they want to hang out with their families, and then maybe go and get food outside every now and then, just the way that everybody else does. While that's certainly true, it's also the case that and while it's true that there is a very small minority of people who are talking about implementing the Khilafah, unfortunately, the small minority is really quite vocal in a way that the opposite side is not. But then there's a counter argument to this, which is sort of the terrorism argument that you mentioned, which had to do with 2 decades of mea culpa, Muslims browbeating themselves, saying we hate terrorism and we condemn the loss of all life, and oh, you're taking this verse from the Quran out of context, and it never seems to quite land. And then I understand that there's a great deal of frustration with that. And I'm not really saying, by the way, that we should just keep doing this, keep humiliating ourselves in the hope that one day some of these people will see that we're not actually that bad. I understand that just can't happen. But it also has to be said that for the vast majority of British people, most British people have been extraordinarily good to Muslims. I mean, this country has been an incredibly fruitful place for Muslims to live and be and exist for the better part of the last 50 years. there definitely exists some contingency for which any argument you make, anything you say will just never land, right? And this is certainly true. But the question now is, where is the median, right? Where is the average British person going? Where is the normal person who historically never really thought about Muslims and is now constantly looking at the world around them completely changing, and they're, the fact that they can't pay their bills, and the fact that their lives are getting immeasurably worse in every way, and that this happens to coincide with like a huge ascendancy in the number of brown faces they see when they walk down the street. People get upset, they start to draw correlations, and then they start to do things. And so accordingly, you need to also think about what an appropriate politics for Muslims really is. And so, echoing the sort of like fundamental theme, and I really want to say that this is the theme of this discussion, has to be the idea that we've reached a tipping point. Things really can't stay the way they are, and a new equilibrium will have to be found. And an example of this previous status quo, this previous way of life that I think cannot be maintained, and this echoes a little bit of what Jacob was just saying, was the sort of, in my view, frankly, quite strange alliance that Muslim politicians have often had with the far left. And obviously, there are certain legitimate grounds for this alliance to take place, because there are certain cause areas where they feel very deeply about in a way that's really quite principled. The most prominent of them is of course, Gaza. But in many other ways, you get the sense that there is a co-opting of leftist language, leftist ideas, leftist causes, leftist politics by Muslims, but also not really in a principled way. Like leftists, most normal leftists will say, okay, yes, we like Muslims, and we like Hindus, and we like Sikhs, and we like Jews, and we like everybody, just because we like diversity and multiculturalism and whatever. And Muslims say, yeah, actually, we like that, but we only like that because you're not you don't hate us, whereas the other guys hate us. But really secretly, as soon as something comes up about supporting gay marriage or about taking a principled stance on some of the other issues that leftists care about, Muslims suddenly, start pulling away. And so that alliance, I think, has always been strange. It always seems strange to me, insofar as I never felt like it could hold. I think it's reached a point where it just fundamentally cannot hold now. In fact, it goes so far as to say that much of the rhetoric on the right has to do with the idea that the real enemy is not just Muslims; they're really the leftists, because they've opened the door to allow Muslims to do whatever it is that they want here in the country, until the Muslims, who are sneaky and smart, have had their way with the leftists by abusing in bad faith the liberal politics that has been afforded to them, and then eventually discard them, and then engage in all of this like illiberal politics. And so that's like that really is like part of the dominant narrative on the far right, the idea that the leftists are just a bunch of naive white liberals who have been taken for fools by these like duplicitous and sneaky fifth column Muslims. And this narrative has to be countered, right? And the only way it can be countered in a lasting way is to be principled. And it's hard to be principled with large chunks of the left de facto by default, because there are large chunks of the left that a lot of Muslims, frankly, just disagree with. And so, which is not to say, by the way, sorry,
it feels like between a rock and a hard place. Then, on the one hand,
it's not easy.
So
right?
meaning, yes, like it certainly felt as though, well, at least, the love affair between sort of median Muslim and the Labour Party kind of ended, but now it's kind of shifted towards the Greens, maybe, and or just a kind of a political homelessness, like just like many in the country, like just feel a sense of, well, there's no one really that represents me. I can actually, because like you said, I'm hated by this side, and seemingly loved by this side, but the guys who love me, I don't really love everything that they stand for. So,
but you could also say that they don't even love you that much. They're just virtue signaling, or
exactly,
precisely. They're instrumentalizing you. It's like the Democratic Party walking into black neighborhoods and promising everything, delivering nothing, just because they know that these black communities are going to vote for the Republicans. No way, except they did in 2016, right? And so
what? Sorry, but then and maybe Jacob, if you want to comment on this as well, like what then are we saying about a relevant way for this community to even organize itself politically in the first place? Or is there a more I don't know if this is like, you know, a more radical sort of a solution, or certainly a contention at least, which is to say, well, the problem you have is that we speak about, you know, Muslims in this kind of monolithic kind of way, but actually not only in terms of their affiliations, theological, doctrinal, legal, what have you, but also in terms of just basic levels of shared governance, infrastructure, and, you know, sort of, if you call it economic organization. There's not really, is there such a thing as a Muslim community, really, if by any of these standards? In fact, perhaps as far as it goes is, you know, you have sort of sometimes effectively organized communities at a very hyper-local level, right, around local mosque. And in an ideal sense, where you might have a governance structure of a mosque that actually allows for participation, you know, by the actual congregation, which is rare, but it exists and will increasingly exist. And then you have like finances flowing, you have a sense of community, and there's a way almost this thing can organize itself relative to the wider sort of community society in that locality. But beyond that, you know, does it even make sense to speak of the way that Muslims can engage politically when there are institutions that claim to speak on behalf of, or some of them that seem like they would, but then they seem to go to pains of saying, well, actually, no, we don't speak on behalf of Muslims. And then I'm wondering, well, who do you speak on behalf of? So there's a really confused sort of picture here. So is it that the institutions aren't, it's about what they're not saying, or is it the fact that the whole structure just doesn't even lend itself to a meaningful, coherent engagement in the first place? Jacob.
Yeah. So I think there's two dimensions to this. And the first is that, of course, you're right that the Muslims as a group in Britain are not organized into some kind of top-down vertical structure. That's part of the reason that the older generation of Muslim organizations that claim to speak for Muslims didn't really succeed in what they set out to do. But that's, of course, also true to quite a large extent of other communities. And so there are still organizations that, to varying degrees, speak for sections of Christian or Jewish or Hindu communities. And that's perfectly reasonable and legitimate. So we need another generation, a new generation of Muslim organizations that will operate in a different way, not only with respect to these kind of liberal commitments I've been talking about, but also, and this is the second prong of the answer here, with respect to how we articulate a vision not just for Muslims in Britain, but for Britain as a whole. And this has to really emphasize, first of all, the shared, if you like, common good that we all take part in. So yes, we have shared interests, we have shared commitments as Muslims. We also have shared interests and commitments as British citizens. And when we claim to be speaking for what is right for Britain to do, that shared interest has to come first. We need to be very clear why the things we think are in the interests of Muslims, good for Muslims, consistent with our values, are also in the interests of Britain and the whole of the country, and consistent with those shared values. So, for instance, when you look at organizations like the Muslim Vote, TMV, which on one level has done a lot of good by organizing communities against the atrocities in the Middle East, but has also employed rhetoric, and the whole sectarian thing was grossly overblown, but it has employed rhetoric that seems to imply, oh, all Muslims should vote the same way. We have the same commitments, we have the same political views. If you're a Muslim, you should vote this way. This is the Muslim-aligned candidate in this area. And from an outsider's point of view, looking at that kind of rhetoric, it looks worrying. It looks like this is a community trying to claim things for itself and not concerned with the wider common good. So that commitment to the good of the country that we're part of has to be much more foregrounded, more prominent. And we can still organize, we can still have organizations speaking for Muslims, but they need to think about the common good of the whole country, not as a side thought or as, oh, it's also good for Britain, but as their first principle and as the rhetorical foreground that gets put out there and emphasized the most.
Okay. Just to pause for a second, I just want to let people know, so in about 10 minutes or so, we'll be happy to take your questions. Feel free, if you have a burning question already, feel free to raise your hand virtually so that you are high up on the queue, or you can use the Q&A box just to kind of type in your written question as well. I will give preference to the sort of audio questions, but you can also type it into the box. Yep, go for it, Mustafa.
I was just going to say that, like, to a certain extent, you know, Muslims have historically not been very sensitive to optics and how they're seen. So I must reiterate and be very clear that, like, much of what both Jacob and I have been talking about here has not really been about a condemnation of the Muslim community as it exists in Britain today. Nobody's saying that Muslims are evil or bad or unintegrated or whatever. But this is how we are seen. It is just true. It's just true that that's how we are seen. And then the question becomes, what is, and it's, to a certain extent, you can't go into people's minds and change their thoughts. All you can do is control your reactions. And we need to recognize what an appropriately principled and appropriately trustworthy and an appropriately strong reaction would be. And so to that end, I would discourage too much panic and scaremongering. But secondly, on the point of view of institutions, as you say, and community organizing, I would say that if you take a look at the sort of like Muslim landscape, and Muslims in some ways are very diverse. So contrary to what people say, there are Muslims doing a great deal of very successful in business. There are Muslims at Goldman Sachs making lots of money. There are Muslims in technology. There are Muslims in academia, and then there are Muslims who are owning mom and pop shops all around the country. There are Muslims doing all kinds of stuff, right? But if you stop and start, if you're not Muslim now, if you are a Muslim, you have a reasonably good sense of what the community looks like. Okay, these people are Shias, and these people are Sunnis, and these people are Barelvis, and these people are Bandis. You have like a good sense of fine distinctions inside the community. These people are the sort of Salafis, or these people are more extreme. You have a sense, and so you say, well, I'm not like that, and so why would anybody confuse me for like some guy from Hizb ut-Tahrir who wants to build a caliphate in South London, and from our point of view, it's completely obvious. But then from the point of view of somebody who's not you, some guy who knows nothing about Islam or nothing about Muslims, nothing about anything, they looking at you and looking at them would basically say, and you can say that this is racism if you like, or you can say whatever, but people will pattern match, right? People will say they will not be able to make, and to a certain extent can't be faulted for not being able to make fine distinctions. They will not be able to understand the difference between somebody who's genuinely very hardcore and probably not very good for public life here, and somebody who's just perfectly reasonable. And so it's up to Muslims to also make those distinctions. And this has to be done in a way that is not simply, again, humiliating, right? Like Muslims try to do this in a certain kind of way. And again, I have to respect everybody who, to a certain extent, everybody who tried to do this by, saying, okay, yes, we're not terrorists. We actually care about life. If a single man dies, it's as if the whole world has died, and vice versa. People love to quote this verse from the Quran. But it has to be a bit more strong. It has to be clear. You need to be able to make these fine distinctions and say that these are aspects of Muslim communal life, Muslim thought, Muslim belief, parts of the community that are just functionally not liberal, not or unable to function in liberal society.
Okay, so two questions then. So one for you first, Mustafa, and then maybe Jacob as well, right? I just want to take two case studies, one of which has been mentioned, and then one other one, recent prominent one, just to then illustrate or to help understand your views in terms of what the right balance is between principle, pragmatism, optics, etc. So Mustafa, like Jacob mentioned, the Muslim vote, right? And so and mentioned some of the problems with that, some of the benefits. So the question then is, in light of what you've said, is that should such a thing cease to exist? Because for as long as you have something called the Muslim vote, regardless of what it actually kind of puts out there, it will be seen just from a brand perspective, optics, right? That this, it doesn't matter, right? The fine distinctions will not be able to be made because beneath the headline is simply this organizing Muslim force. There is a Muslim vote, and so that in and of itself is a problem. Or should it, in that case, no? If for example that organization does the work of bringing what you might call actual principles to bear, which are universal principles to bear in thinking about who might be best candidates or representative of these principles generally, that are not about simply the Muslim interest but the national interest, and therefore to exemplify the way in which the Muslim vote can be a universal thing. How do you think about that question?
So I would just like in a line, in a certain sense, you don't need to go crazy thinking about building more Muslim institutions, building good Muslim institutions. What you need is good Muslims building good institutions. If that makes sense. Like, you don't need to be building Muslim institutions. You just need Muslims building good institutions.
Okay. So okay, fine. But then does that mean, the question is then go a step further. Why do you need Muslims building good institutions, meaning Muslims only building good institutions? I remember even when I was at National Zakat Foundation, I would have these discussions with others, and then you would have these questions of like, what's the difference between an Islamic institution, a Muslim institution, a Muslim-led institution, right? Do you see what I mean? Like, and then all of a sudden it's sort of, You might have you might actually have, I mean, is there such a thing as an Islamic institution that's led by a minority of Muslims, but led by a bunch of others just because the thing reflects like these universal values that are quote unquote, Islamic. So, but just if I don't know if it's too much just to press you then, but it's just explicitly on this kind of Muslim vote thing as an example, like, is it that no, like the optics are just such and the risks are such that actually organizing yourself in this way in the first place or branding it in such a way, is a problem, regardless of what you're going to say? Or is it no, absolutely, it should exist and be upfront about it, and that's fine, and absolutely entitled to do it, but just do it in a way that is universal and not entirely self-centered, such that you don't, add to the paranoia that already exists.
So I do certainly think it's bad optics. I think that's like definitely true. That I think that it certainly hasn't helped her case in seeming less self-absorbed and less concerned solely with like Muslim ethnic grievances and ethnic issues. So I think that's like at minimum definitely true, that it should at least be presented as something more universal. I would say to a certain extent at a principled level, I would like it to be more universal in a principled way. I think that would and I mean, again, Islam is it's a universalist faith insofar as in order for something to be Islamic, it doesn't necessarily have to be Pakistani. It doesn't have to be Turkish. It doesn't have to be, Lebanese or whatever. As the famous Sufi aphorism goes, the water takes on the color of the cup. There must exist a form of a representation of Islamic universalist values and virtues that is able to exemplify itself here in a way that does not simply seek to benefit people of a certain identitarian disposition, but rather seeks to maximize the good in society as a whole. And this commitment to the common good of society is, while it's certainly present among a lot of Muslims, I'm not even saying that that's not true, it certainly needs to be talked about more, and you need more people doing that. Because the most organized groups, in a certain sense, the most organized groups you see in Britain engaging in Muslim, in Muslim politics, are largely, these biradari clan style politics that you find in, hyper Muslim strongholds, in parts of Bradford or parts of Birmingham or parts of Blackburn or whatever, and to a certain extent, this only further entrenches the idea that there's a certain kind of clannishness, a certain disintegration, a certain sectarianism, a certain separatism even. It's almost like walking, for somebody else, it would be like walking into a totally different country.
Sure.
And then simultaneously, you have a lot of, I want to say, to a certain extent, to a certain extent, integrated Muslims, or rather Muslims who are doing relatively well, who for the longest part have not engaged in communal life, who have not engaged in organizing parts of the community, who have not spoken out enough, who have not gotten involved enough. And these included people who are, probably large chunks of your audience listening now, and this is your call to action, is to start speaking out more, to start getting involved, engaged more, to find a way of building, good institutions that can exemplify universalist values, that would help foment and build the sort of trust that Jacob was talking about that we've lost now. Or, I mean, it doesn't matter if we've lost it or not lost it. It's just not there. It doesn't matter if it's not even a question of whose fault it is. It's just not there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and then Jacob, maybe just to finish off before we get some sort of audience questions in. Obviously, recently there was, a lot of what we've discussed essentially came, sort of all the issues came to a head or came together or were symbolized in this, furore that took place just at the end of Ramadan and post-Ramadan with regards to this prayer in Trafalgar Square, right? So you essentially now have the Ramadan Tent Project, which for years has been organizing these open iftars, has basically had a relatively diverse range of people from all walks of life coming together in all sorts of types of institutions, breaking fast, doing probably in that regard, one of the foremost examples of doing probably the kind of things which I imagine you both would approve of in one sense. But despite its best efforts and the act, the prayer itself, the call to prayer, the congregational prayer that then took place was then, taken, arguably put out of context and then expressed as an act of domination. And then you had people who, it's not just those to the right of, for example, reform, but even characters like Jenrick and others within Reformed jumping on this and saying, absolutely, this is an act of domination, should be behind closed doors, etc., etc. So again, you have this kind of something which, and so on a really practical level, given everything that we've said, what does this organization, I know you probably don't want to get into the specific policies of this or that organization, but just as an advisor, theoretically, let's say, what does this organization do next year? Does it organize this iftar in Trafalgar Square or not? Because on the one hand, you don't want to just, sort of bow to this kind of to this pressure and this the twisted narratives that emerge. But on the other hand, responsibility, optics, etc., and the risk of things being just made worse, even by doing something in a well-meaning way. So what's the?
And this is a fantastic question that illustrates all of the issues we've been discussing, really, about trust. Optics isn't a question of do you do a thing or not. It's a question of with what attitude and with what description do you do it. So if you look at this case about public prayer, the reason people are saying this is an act of domination ultimately comes from the fact that a small minority of Muslims, you can look at groups like Five Pillars or organizations like this, will say, in a sense, it is an act of domination. They'll say, in an ideal society, we'd have dhimmi laws that would prevent Christians from proselytizing, and we'd have this public prayer and they wouldn't be allowed it, right? And that's a small minority, but it's real. And on the other side, you don't have an equally vocal, equally clear, equally explicit, equally, if you like, traditional sounding or theologically explained position as to why we don't want to dominate, why we do want to have the same civil status as other groups. And so from the point of view of certain outsiders looking at this, not making these fine distinctions, not knowing what's going on, they get into their heads, well, some Muslims want to take over. And when we see these big public displays, we don't see any really explicit explanation of why this is not an attempt to take over. What are we supposed to think? So my, if you like, advice, and I'm not here to tell any organization what to do, but in terms of a general kind of principled approach, we should absolutely be defending the right to pray in public, not just because it's a defensive thing as Muslims, because it's in the interests of this country as a country committed to religious freedom that is good for everyone of all religions or none. But we should also be very clear when we organize big public displays, we should be very, very mindful of the fact that there's a minority of Muslims saying things that are concerning. There isn't an explicitly clear counter narrative from Muslims who take a different view of these civil rights and liberties. And so this needs to be done with the very, very clear intention. Look, what we're here, it needs to be explained to people. We're doing this because we want to support the particular spiritual vision that we think Islam brings to the nation, and also the universal values of religious freedom and human dignity that we celebrate. And no, we don't want to take over. We don't want to dominate or subordinate Christians or other groups. And here's why. And there needs to be a credible statement of why we don't want to do that, even in an ideal society in which we're 51% of the country or whatever. And that's what's missing, I think. And that's what will deal with this optics problem. It's not a question of should we pray in public or not. It's a question of when we pray in public, with what intention and what explanation of our act do we do it.
Sure. But in a line, it feels to me very difficult, if not impossible, regardless of whatever explanations and intentions there might be, for the average, the average sort of person on the ground who can't make these fine distinctions, to hear or watch something on TikTok or on social media that as soon as you have Allahu Akbar and and then bowing and prostrating of many non-white people, there's no amount of explanation that's going to make that palatable, and so again, is it almost an impossible problem?
No, I don't think that it is. I don't think there's anything intrinsic to the words of the call to prayer or the Muslim act of prostration. I mean, if you think about it, the act of prostration is not an act of domination. It's the complete opposite of that. It's an act of
Sure. Yeah.
Nothing intrinsic to that has to be more threatening than a Hindu or Sikh celebration in Trafalgar Square. So sure, in the short term, it's going to take time. It's going to be challenging to deal with these deep-rooted beliefs that have taken a long time to build up. But ultimately, it's absolutely possible. We should be optimistic about what we can achieve.
Cool. All right.
Nobody has that kind of reaction, by the way, on TikTok when they see. So it's not just a question of alienism, or alienation rather. Nobody has that reaction when they see a bunch of Buddhist monks sitting on TikTok. And okay, yes, nobody says, "Oh, this is scary or alien or weird." Everybody says, "Oh, this is wonderful and peaceful and Zen." And maybe they'll have misconceptions about what this entails. but we just have to simply recognize that it's not like we are also called to think good of the median person, that it is possible, in fact, to trust the median person and have them trust us. By the way, this does not mean that there don't exist genuinely hostile elements all over the place. Like, I've had conversations with people on the right where I've argued with them, telling them that the Ramadan 10 project is actually a wonderful initiative and exactly the kind of thing that you want Muslims to be doing. This is in fact like exactly what you want. There are Muslims for you to worry about. These are not those people. And so we need to start helping to contribute to the ability to make fine distinctions. We need people on this side being more vocal, being more strong. For the Ramadan 10 project, by the way, I would say that they absolutely must persist. Like, I don't think like cowing down would send the wrong message both to the community. It would indicate that it's impossible for us to adapt and find an equilibrium. And if the project is principled, which it is, and correctly in the common good of the society, you would in fact want to maintain the course. And then if people complain about it, this is completely fine.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. If you'd like to ask a question, please do raise your hand. I can bring you in. Don't be shy. Don't be shy, people. Right. Yes. Okay. We've got a question here from Ali. Ali, you can unmute yourself.
So they couldn't be upon you all. Thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. Question really, comments and a question really for Mustafa, and I guess more specifically for yourself, Jacob, because you mentioned about various institutions that have existed over the years, both Muslim and sort of counter extremism. And you for example, you mentioned Quilliam specifically, and how that's been an example of kind of a negative force in this sort of fight. But it just struck me that as the conversation evolved and as I was listening to both of you, it sort of seemed as though what you were proposing as a solution was in a way sort of similar from my recollection anyway to what Quilliam was kind of doing, which in other words is to like take classical liberalism as the ideal, as you put in, not just a compromise for Muslims, but like actually a philosophical ideal, and essentially come to a point where we as Muslims can get behind that wholesale philosophically, and hence, become integrated into Britain societally. And, the examples you gave were that although it might be a minority, there are, Muslims who have inclinations towards the existence of an Islamic state and so on and so forth. But to my mind, just seeing what Quilliam did over the years, that argument just doesn't cut it for me, because even like wanting in a theoretical world the existence of, a khilafah, firstly, I really don't think most people who do want that actually want it in the UK. Even Hizb ut-Tahrir, if I understand correctly, don't actually call for that in the UK specifically. But secondly, it just seems to be quite theoretical and academic. Like, I'm not sure to what extent those views actually are inimical to Muslim integration in Britain. It just seems more academic and hypothetical, and is used as almost like a convenient sort of punching bag or stick to beat us with. That because you can't say that the punishment for theft wouldn't be X, Y, Z in your ideal world, therefore you're not liberal, and therefore this is the problem, and this is why no one's going to accept us. Is there not a third option here? Like, it just seems like what we're proposing is kind of the same as what's already been attempted. And to me, that it just doesn't seem to have worked or is consistent with our principles as Muslims. So yeah, it's kind of a challenge, I guess, back to you guys and to yourself specifically, Jacob, on that.
Yeah, so 2 points I'd make initially, and thanks very much for the really thoughtful question there. And one is, Quilliam, as I think we know, was in many ways a fake organization. It was essentially, funded by the British government. It wasn't a grassroots organization. It masqueraded as one. That's not what we want. It's not what we need. It's not going to do any good. Quilliam was also deeply bound up with the government's attempt to do this in a coercive fashion, to basically try to force or prod Muslims and Muslim communities into claiming to believe these things. That doesn't work. That hasn't worked. You're quite right to point out that failed. Now, where I would just gently push back in a certain sense is the claim that these theo-political commitments are just theoretical. They're deeply, deeply tied to the very real examples of these flashpoint issues that lead to concerns about integration. So one of the cases, I've been on GB News probably a dozen times over the last year to talk about these issues and kind of defend the Muslim community against various accusations. And one that constantly gets brought up to me again and again. There's a teacher supposedly in hiding in Batley because of an incident regarding alleged blasphemy, right? And this is constantly brought up to me, and it's said to me, well, this is what Muslims would do. If you guys were a majority, you'd have blasphemy laws. You'd put people in prison for saying bad things about the Quran, etc., etc. And I'm constantly having to defend that. And if we don't have a principled commitment to these liberal freedoms, what am I supposed to say? There is nothing to say because I don't have any common value that I can then appeal to and say, no, we do share some basic ground rules as principles, not just as pragmatism. And if we lack that common ground rule, if we lack that common value, on what basis do we actually defend our own freedoms either? There's no shared principle we can appeal to. So these things sound theoretical, but I think they're actually deeply, deeply real and practical too. Mustafa, do you want to add anything to that?
So I obviously agree with you because I've also been on GB News and had to field questions of a similar nature where essentially the premise is always, okay, yeah, but you seem reasonable, but there's tons of you guys out there that are going to do crazy things as soon as we let them off the hook. And in fact, they have probably been doing crazy things. We just haven't been noticing. And then the grooming gangs comes up, right? And the fact that there was no systematic Muslim whistleblower of any kind, that it turned into that the left, in a certain sense, there's evidence to suggest that this wasn't made more public, that the police didn't investigate it as a result of it potentially becoming a racial or a religious issue. From the point of view of somebody who's not Muslim, this just seems nuts. This just seems like you've allowed in a kind of cancer. I'm not saying this is what we are. I'm just saying if you're like a median guy who's like reading about the grooming gang scandal, you'd be like, what is this cancer we have let into our society? And that's genuinely what people now think. This is why politics looks the way it does, right? Like we can't, which again echoes the point that we've been hammering this whole conversation, which is that essentially things cannot stay the same. So if we want to go out and say, yes, in an ideal society, we'd like to chop off people's heads for leaving Islam, but don't worry, we're not going to do it here, then nobody's going to believe you. They're just going to be like, okay, well, wait for the demographics to kick in, and then they'll start chopping heads in Bradford, but maybe not in London where they're not the majority. They'll start chopping heads in Birmingham, but not here. And so this is like so you can't have this like, okay, yes, in a purely academic way, we would like to see Damascus rise again, or we would like to see the rebuilding of a Khilafah in an Islamic homeland, but that we don't really believe. I mean, to a certain extent, that's fine, right? Like different countries can rule themselves however we like, and we can have different preferences for how Pakistan or Syria or Turkey or whatever should be ruled, and this is totally fine. But at least in the context of the UK, there is still a trust issue, right? So when people start talking about grandiose things that are fairly disconnected from what people currently live like, then this trust issue worsens. And at this point, we need to sort of we need to sort of bridge that gap a little bit. And but the Ramadan 10 project, by the way, I will reiterate, is like a fantastic project in that space. I think I want to say very unequivocally that that's like exactly the right kind of thing. And the fact that it was attacked should indicate that obviously there are malicious forces that are and so
maybe,
so-
Ali, do you want to? I'll give you a chance to come back one time if you'd like. Or did you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I take the point. I take the point that it's all very well saying that nobody wants this here, but then it gives rise to the fear that if we were to become a majority, then surely we'd change that. I mean, I feel like
nobody walks around parts of Bradford and says, I don't want to throw too much shade at Bradford, but like nobody walks around parts of these communities and says, oh yeah, we'd love it if society looked like that. Like the average white guy walking around parts of these communities, they don't walk around thinking, oh, how wonderful. I would love it if Chelsea looked like Whitechapel. Like nobody thinks that. Like not a single, like even brown people don't think that.
But you don't think, sorry, I don't mean to take up any like more.
I apologize. I don't want to be too hard to people in Whitechapel or anywhere.
No, but I just back to your point, Jacob, on the kind of idealization of certain laws that wouldn't be palatable in a liberal society. Okay, fine. Like it's all well and good to say that it still wouldn't be. It's not going to wash with the average Brit to say that these Muslims, they don't want that here. But if an ideal state were in place and certain conditions were met, then they would. But also, I know you're saying it's non-academic, but like we all know or understand to some extent that fiqh is a very complex and detailed field, and that in reality, like a lot of these things wouldn't even end up taking place in the first place. And it's sort of like, then are we just obsessing over this one kind of minute portion of Islamic law as holding us back from integrating when actually it's almost like a smokescreen. That I don't know. I just feel like that's what I came away with from the the rise and fall of Quilliam, and I just don't want to see that kind of being done again. Not least by people who are actually from the Muslim community. That's the concern on my part.
Well, I mean, I'm gonna sound like I'm reiterating the same thing, but when I speak to people who are like on the right or who are part of this, if you like, anti-Muslim movement, these are the things that they bring up to me. These are the things that they worry about. So I'm not saying that these are the issues because in some academic way I've theorized that they are. I'm saying these are the issues because these are the things I'm constantly having to defend and talk about, and that are being pushed on me, and that they want the answers to. I go on and I do an interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the polling on Muslim communities in Britain. And, I just want to talk about practical bread and butter issues. And he wants to say, oh, but what did the prophet think about Jews 1400?
Yeah. Oh,
He wants to bring up the theology. It's not me who wants to do that. He wants to do it. They're very, very interested in this. So these
That's right. And I would just add to that, like in my observation, certainly in the online space, like, well, I only really kind of use YouTube because I just can't handle the other platforms. But certainly it's been surprising to me the extent to which, I mean, oftentimes you have these random guys who seem to know the verses better than most Muslims, right? And then using them to make their, to sort of weaponizing them essentially to make their points, and then wondering about wondering about exactly what these things imply fundamentally.
And I would just say one thing regarding, was it Ali's question? Really important. I think you're absolutely, well, I agree with you completely, is that this is a small area of fiqh. It's not that important in a certain sense. It's not actually central to, the whole of fiqh, or certainly not to the whole of Islam. So why are we less willing to just say that's not what we want, even in principle? It's not like we're sacrificing the most fundamental theological commitments of the faith. We're absolutely not in many ways. I think, these, if you like, liberal values are more consistent with our basic commitments. There was always pluralism in fiqh, and there's, a great many unimaginably different features of society today that mean it has to be applied intelligently and not just rote learning from medieval manuals. I don't think anyone just thinks you can transpose those books of how society should be organized to the present day without any thought or attention. So we need to de-emphasize it, but we have to be explicit and direct about that and not let others do it for us.
All right.
I just want to add a very tiny thing, very
briefly. Go on. Yep.
It is my worst nightmare to be compared more and more to Quilliam. I will clarify this. Like, almost everything they did was deleterious for the community. It would be bad for us to start increasingly weaponizing the state as a hammer to start smashing regular Muslims over the head with. This is not what we want. What we want is to find a new equilibrium, and to be honest about how things currently are.
Sure. Thank you. All right. Well, we have a question from the wonderfully named Great Gatsby. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Hello. Hi. Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. I think this is titled, "Do Muslims Have a Future in Britain After the Next General Election?" And in my opinion, they do, definitely. And very much so. And I think I'm myself from a Muslim background, just for everyone's information. And I think, as a matter of fact, I think they probably grow in influence and power in the coming years, in the coming decades.
And do you have a question?
Not particularly. It's just an observation.
You just wanted to offer us some hope.
Yes, because it said, because the way it reads is, "Do Muslims have a future?" It's a bit depressing, but I think they definitely do. Definitely.
No, thank you. No, appreciate the optimism. No, thank you. All right, great. Well, let's move on to Usman Shima. Usman.
Hi, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. By the way, I think your analysis is excellent, and also thank you, Iqbal, for introducing these guys, because I wasn't aware of this organization before they came onto your platform. So, obviously the situation doesn't look good politically for Muslims, and especially what we hear in the media also looks, pretty dire. I guess question number one, there's a few questions, but they're all very much related. I guess question number one is, I guess everybody should accept that that's not likely to change within the next election cycle. And at best, what we're probably fighting for is the following election cycle. Not that there's an endpoint anyway. This is something that we should be trying to work on all the time anyway. So I guess that's question number one. Question number two is, in the US, at least from a media perspective, and to some extent from a political perspective, the situation looks a bit better, at least from my perspective. And I know that there are huge differences, but the second question would be, is there anything that we can take from what's happening in the US, or any lessons that we can learn? And then third question, which is related to the second question, is, given the situation that we face, when we look historically, of course, the natural thing to think about is, pre-World War II kind of a situation, which is obviously extreme, and we're in a very different situation to that. But can we also take lessons from other communities or other periods of history to also try and help us?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. Great question. So I'll try to sort of bring those into harmony with each other. So I think what we're seeing happening right now is we all know there's a backlash, that Britain is sort of moving to the right in a lot of ways. Now, whoever wins the next election, whichever party it is, I think a few things are going to need to happen for this situation to calm down. And one of those things is that there's going to need to be a more sensible, balanced, proportionate approach to issues around immigration. The pace has been extremely high. It's caused all kinds of integration problems. It needs to slow down for a period of time if people can calm down about it. And then whatever happens in terms of party politics, I think once the kind of acute issues are actually dealt with, a lot of the impetus for the extremism, and this ties into your question about, are we living in the Weimar Republic? Is there going to be some kind of, hideous fascist movement coming? Well, the closest thing to that, and I don't think they are that, but the closest thing to that is the ethno-nationalist movement around kind of Restore Britain and Rupert Lowe. Now, they're not Nazis, but they have some pretty unpleasant views. They're far, in a sense, I think there's a fundamental line between them and Reform. Reform are a sort of civic nationalist party that think that certain groups are really hard to integrate, and that causes all kind of problems. Whereas Restore is an ethno-nationalist party that thinks that if you have the wrong heritage, you can't be British, and maybe we can tolerate you as guests, but, you're not ever going to be fully British. Now, my interpretation, and I think Mustafa would agree with me on this, is that what's driving this ethno-nationalist movement is just a kind of visible failure of the current settlement. And people are thinking, well, look, we've tried, people think to themselves, and sort of reconstructing the rhetoric I see on Twitter and so forth, they think to themselves, look, we tried civic nationalism, we tried integration, it didn't work. But what I would say is we didn't really try it properly. And that ties into everything we've been saying, for the last hour. It hasn't been tried in a way that's actually systematic and serious from both sides to build that mutual trust. So, my hope is that through a more sensible, moderate approach to all of these issues, as we've been discussing, we can diffuse that extreme sentiment. And on your final element of the question about the US, I agree with you. I think there are lots of organizations, we could look at from different perspectives, and I'm not sort of endorsing either one of them wholly, but you can look at groups like, the International Institute of Islamic Thought or Zaytuna College, who I think have done a good job of at least trying to articulate a healthy civic vision for Muslims in America. Of course, there are other benefits, advantages Muslims have there. Generally, they came from more educated and affluent backgrounds, which help with integration too. But yeah, I think there is stuff we can learn from America. And yeah, we should be looking into ways that we can do that.
I mean, America also benefits from having much more strongly defined constitutional protections for freedoms, which is a thing that in a certain sense, this country is slowly eroding. This country both gave birth to and is slowly eroding. And much of the purpose of what we're talking about here is that actually those freedoms are freedoms that we benefit from as Muslims. This is why we're able to practice Islam, why people are able to walk around in the hijab, and this is totally fine and a good thing. Are able to organize themselves as they like, etc. But there's a certain amount of give and take that needs to take place, and that the mechanism by which that is undertaken is a good thing, and that there needs to be this buy-in to that system.
Yep. Okay. And I'm just going to take a written question before we get back to the audio ones. So Kareem asks, it seems the conversation has taken the premise that classical liberalism is essential to the identity of Britain, and hence the question of Muslim integration is essentially a question of Muslims accepting liberal principle. But is there a post-liberal future for Britain? Has classical liberalism and Enlightenment ideology delivered its promises or failed? So yeah, Mustafa, what do you want to say to that, or Jacob?
No, Jacob, I mean, if post-liberalism is your thing, go for it.
Yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, I think, if there is a post-liberal future, meaning an anti-liberal future or some kind of alternative to liberalism, it's not going to be one that we have any reason to like, either as kind of decent people in general or specifically as Muslims. The only real serious alternative to liberalism, if you like, of a certain kind being promoted in Britain is this ethno-nationalist stuff linked to Restore. The rest of the political spectrum, I would argue it's a family dispute within liberalism. Who is a threat to liberalism? How should we interpret liberal values? How should we weigh up and trade off different liberal commitments? The post-liberal sort of zeitgeist is much more of an American thing. It's linked to kind of Catholic theocrats who are completely crazy and abhorrent. They're not a big movement in Britain. The only alternative is a really nasty, silly ethno-nationalism. So I don't hold out any real hopes for post-liberalism. I don't think we should be hitching our wagons to that movement.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Farhad, yep, go for it.
Yeah, Salam, gents. So I think Mustafa mentioned earlier, the reasons for demonization of Muslims. One could argue that, for the last 20 or 30 years, it's this whole Islamophobia industry, I'm not a big fan of the term, it's been used to justify, wars abroad and, wealth extraction. It feels like, with the rise of the global south, with the rise of BRICS, that has changed. The rationale, the reason for demonization of Muslims is much more inward, right, to cover for kind of wealth extraction is going to take place locally. Assuming premise, is there opportunity for us if the future is going to be in the global south? Is opportunities for us to build bridges that way to kind of not only protect ourselves but kind of build some of these institutions locally?
I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, there's like a fairly left, like Marxist style analysis, but fine, I'll concede the premise. I think it's undeniably true we're heading into a multipolar world. The sort of like unilateral, American hegemonic, Anglo hegemonic system has essentially frayed and is slowly disintegrating. And a big part of what it means to exist now in a sensible way is to come to grips with that fact. And so from that point of view, I mean, it's hard to disagree with you. Yes, there is opportunity. Like, I think there's tons of opportunity in BRICS and in the Middle East to some extent, hopefully after everything calms down. In a lot of third country options, which afford people, once again, the very nice opportunity to go and shop around in a certain sense for systems or ideologies that they like. And to a lot of Muslims, I would encourage them to be adventurous and to try that. I feel like there's no necessary. I mean, to a certain extent, a big, much of this conversation was really not that normative. It's really not. It was mostly descriptive about this is what the world looks like, and now we can either deal with that fact or we can't. And much of that had to do with what the world currently looks like in a Britain that is definitely post-peak, and trying to come to grips with what it even is anymore. I mean, the notion of what constitutes Britain is a question that's currently up for grabs. And so from that point of view, as Britain continues to grapple with itself and becomes more and more navel-gazy and inward-looking, it's undeniable. Yeah, it's absolutely undeniable that there's lots of opportunity in BRICS. I think there's lots of opportunity in Turkey and Pakistan, in the Middle East, in the Levant now increasingly.
Okay. I feel like I want to counter that, but I'll just keep my mouth shut for now. Go on, Jacob. Anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Mustafa knows more about wealth extraction than me, so I'm going to...
No.
Okay, fine. All right. Look, we've got one interesting question here. So maybe Jacob, you can take this. Faz asks, do you think a solution is to mimic Singapore's ethnic integration policy, restricting what are effectively high-density areas of specific ethnic and religious groups? Then he says the upnetification. Upne is like, I don't know if you know this word, Jacob, but basically upne means like our lot. Yeah. So the upnetification. Yeah, exactly. What people see is that's what people see, meaning this high-density kind of areas, etc., and that's what scares people and feeds a large number of social media videos. These sort of, I don't know, no-go areas, kind of that. I'm thinking about this.
I mean, I think there's two points to making, and one is that Singapore is in a certain sense a refutation of the far right because it's a successful, I mean, in a highly successful, explicitly multicultural society. On the other hand, there's a lot of features of Singapore that we shouldn't want to emulate in Britain, like its extremely authoritarian policing, like its explicit kind of privileging of the Han Chinese above other ethnic groups, and its policy of really direct and sometimes coercive kind of demographic management of how we're going to maintain a balance between these various groups. So Singapore is not a model to follow. There are some specific things we might try to sort of look at and study in more detail. But, you know, I think what we should be looking at is how the good features of Singapore, the kind of intercommunal harmony, can be done without the illiberal features, without the authoritarian statist features. That would be a healthier model for Britain and something to study.
I think it's
Mustafa,
also worth highlighting that Singapore is a relatively small, geographically well-located country with very few people that are densely populated. I mean, that comes with its own challenges, obviously, right? Like lack of natural resources, etc. But the fact that it's a very tiny country means that it's much more amenable to this kind of management. The only other country that you can think of that is a large country that has engaged in this kind of stuff, that in this kind of like very heavy-handed state activity that has been successful, is in some sense China, which is by no means multicultural or multi-ethnic. In fact, I mean, if you think about what they're doing, I mean, obviously everybody here is very conscious about what's happening with the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. It's hard to, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Singapore is like I can see the point that Singapore is fantastically, amazingly well run, and it was, you know, but to what extent this can be done in a much larger country, I'm a bit skeptical.
Yeah, definitely don't want that rule about no chewing gum in public. I mean, I don't, I can't handle that. Okay, look, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but just a couple of points mentioned here. One is there a legitimate reason during marches, speeches, etc., to say or chant Allahu Akbar? Why don't people just say God is great instead? Wouldn't that go somewhere in removing the irrational stigma associated with the Arabic version? And Fatima mentions, you know, both together would be best, Arabic and English versions. I mean, this goes to the point I was trying to make earlier, well, the question I was trying to ask around the whether or not the kind of the perceived. See, on the one hand, you have the idea we can say, okay, well, you know, Buddhists might do kind of chanting in foreign languages, and you know, other Hindus or whoever might have, you know, again, similar kind of things going on, where it's, you know, quite clearly foreign but welcome and accepted and even celebrated. But then, yeah, there's a particular problem with the Arabic, you know, being received for various reasons. But on the other hand, Mustafa, as you kind of mentioned, there is that the you know, the water takes the color of the cup, right? And so you've got maybe more of a principled reason as to why you know, things should be anglicized, because it makes it actually intelligible, makes it relatable, makes it potentially compelling. Like the actual underlying message isn't obscured, and it reminds me of that Quranic phrase, you know, constantly addressing the Prophet, peace be upon him, telling him that the only thing you need to do is to convey clearly. And so the Arabic language being cited as the language of revelation, so that you understand, it's clearly an address to its initial recipients. So this is maybe we're starting to get into a more sort of theological matters. I appreciate that, but is there anything you want to say about like just this, I don't know, language in general, and then as it pertains to these various things and intelligibility to the wider population?
Yeah, I think I would back it. I mean, I think it would be good if more Islamic discourse, as it were conducted in English and not in languages from back home. You know, I mean, if you genuinely believe that Islam is a faith for mankind, and that, you know, it is universal in character and universal in nature, then you must find a form. Then it must be able to find a form, an expression, a manifestation that speaks authentically and natively to the culture and the population of whatever people in whatever time in whatever place. And so there's an underrated aspect of this whole, you know, Islamophobia discussion, or, you know, the future of Muslims discussion that we've been having, that we haven't touched on too much, but which is really quite central, is ultimately the distinction between cultural commitments and theological commitments, and to what extent these commitments are maintained, and to what extent they need to be shed, if anything. You know, so that's not me talking about, you know, mandating the idea that everybody has to say Allahu Akbar in English, but simply the idea that there are, in fact, lots of there is in fact just frankly a lot of cultural baggage that comes about as a result of us being from, or our families being from wherever they're from, and then they come here, and some of it's culture and some of it's faith. This is a very obvious thing to say, and again, people out, internally we know what the faith is and what it means, but outside people lose fine distinctions. They can't tell the difference.
Yep. Okay. Javeria says, I noticed that whiteness and Muslim are both being framed as oppositional in this discussion. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, but I can understand. Maybe it's just when references to kind of white working class and these kind of things. But I'm sure. In fact, I would say I know my esteemed guests know the difference, because Jacob looks pretty white to me. So why not leave modern Muslimness behind? Muslim identity as ethno-culture in the UK sadly doesn't articulate clearly what God wills in any clear way. We could reframe who we are as believers, or those who submit to God. Unfortunately, building an alternative narrative and presenting the other side, so to speak, to drown out those like 5 pillars isn't enough. It won't work if articulated through a Muslim paradigm.
Very interesting question. So
That is an interesting question.
I mean, I think that
Well, Jacob, go on, you go for it, and then we'll. Yeah.
just initially, I think in a certain sense, part of the point is to articulate it through a Muslim paradigm, because the aim is to counter people's perceptions of Islam. So if we simply say, well, we're just like everyone else, we have exactly the same views as everyone else, we don't use Muslim theological language, then the reaction of those people we're trying to persuade, it might just be, well, you guys are secular Muslims, you're not really that Muslim, you're not even very religious, you're not using religious language here. That's okay, but the more religious Muslims are a problem. So if nothing else, there is at least a strategic reason to use the Muslim paradigm, as you put it. Do you have anything to add to that, Mustafa?
Well, I mean, again, I think I will echo the point I just made, which is that essentially, I think she makes a good point about, like, to a certain extent, shedding cultural baggage or ethnic commitments. And I think that really a big part of the reason we're here is because we have inadequately shed our ethnic commitments and ethnic grievances in a way that feels comfortable for everybody here. Which is not to say, by the way, that you have to come here and start dressing like a native and start talking like a native and being like a native, and that you can't be your own person or whatever. It just means that there is a certain degree of compromise that needs to be maintained.
But I think in this, but I think in this question, and even in what was raised before, you see, I think everybody here kind of understands. Well, at least everyone who probably is listening to this, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that everybody gets the distinction between the ethnic and the cultural on the one hand. Yeah. But I think the specific problem with regards that's kind of being pointed at with this question, and also in the previous question about Allahu Akbar, for example, is the Arabic language, right? And so it's the Arabic. So meaning the more tricky thing is because the Arabic language, even for most people here, is not an ethnic commitment as such, or a cultural commitment.
It's an Islamic commitment.
Right. So then the question is, and I think what's underlying this most recent question is the extent to which that's it. That maybe that like, is it in your language an Islamic commitment, or is it is that part of actually what can be separated out to a large degree, not obviously dismissed in the sense that your kind of source text and what have you, and much of the tradition is expressed in this language, although of course a lot of the tradition also is expressed in all sorts of languages, but that actually in this context, even redefining, and as most people here know, this is one of my kind of favorite little side subjects. Have we missed a trick by talking about Islam and Muslim, when actually fundamentally what it's about is devotion to God, submission to God. God is the ultimate principle, and people are actually devoted to God. Meaning that, therefore, to Jacob's early point, it's not about being less religious. In some ways, it's about trying to be even more faithful, like not trying to kind of unpackage it, or and to show it for what it actually is, so that the obscurities are left to one side, and being absolutely faithful. But yes, I take the point from earlier that essentially that's challenging, because even if some people go off and do that, you're still going to have a vast majority who are in old speak, let's say, and old speak is always going to be used as a means to sort of raise the objections that are being raised. So yeah, do you see the problem there, Mustafa, in terms of specifically the Arabic language as not being exactly clear where it sits?
Well, I mean, you largely already know my views on the finger of the moon, but but then again, this is like very theological, right? Which is
Yeah,
I think like theologically speaking, I think probably we share similar views on the subject, insofar as I do believe that there exists an expression that really quite a lot that we think of as Islam is not really that contiguous with the prophetic message. But then again, this is a very abstract discussion.
sure.
Speaking more particularly about the community, as it were, or about Muslims as people, and to what extent they could find a harmonious way of life with the broader population and with their circumstances here that remains nevertheless principled and committed to the divine. I believe that it's certainly possible. I mean, at least personally, I would believe that it's certainly possible. You know.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
certainly think so. Yeah.
Sure. All right. Okay, I'm just going to read this one last comment.
You saw this process. I mean, to a certain extent, this process happened very naturally in Turkey and Persia, centuries ago, which is why now when you think of Persian, you think of it as almost indistinguishable from Islam.
Yes.
Or Islamicness. Arabic obviously is a bit trickier because it's canonical in a way that nothing else is.
Right.
But also most Muslims, I mean, half of the Muslim discourse in this country is not in Arabic, it's in Urdu or Bengali or Turkish.
Yeah. And actually, interesting on another. I mean,
and why not English, right? That's the idea.
The original Quilliam, William
Mm.
Quilliam. There also, obviously, you have a lot of interesting, let's call it, cultural output. Let's say of then a spiritual or faithful religious nature that is like as English as anything else, right? Which again, is,
precisely right. Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I would point to Tim Winter here, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad here as like a fantastic example. Somebody who's very, very English. I think it's quite hard not to think of him as hyper English, but also hard not to think of him as like very, very Muslim at the same time. And I think that there is almost certainly going to be an expression of a way of life. Not everybody has to be, a Cambridge Don, but surely there exists a version of being, very British and maybe a banker, so that there's hope for me yet. And also Muslim in a principled way that is harmonious with the rest of society.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. No question here, but Frial basically says, what happened to just the most basic of things? Kind to a neighbor, whoever you are, carry out your civic duties wherever you are, park with respect. Yeah, important in Ramadan, especially. What Islam teaches about societal life, be the influence of good, the person that your local community recognizes as the best, the kindest, the fairest, the most helpful. That's where it begins. Contribute, step outside your space a little. It's the simplest of things that makes the most difference. All right. Well, fine. Thank you for that, Frial. All right, we're coming up to the end of time. Just a couple of minutes left. I think I just want to give you both the opportunity just to maybe say one final, just a closing thought, perhaps, or just to give you the opportunity just to summarize or say anything that you want to say but you haven't been able to say. So maybe Mustafa, will start with you, and then Jacob, you can bring us home.
Yes, essentially the sort of moral of the story. We've talked about all kinds of random stuff, but the moral of the whole story is that the status quo cannot be maintained without things becoming very, very ugly. There will need to be a certain degree of change. This change, to some extent, will be painful, but that it's certainly manageable, it's certainly doable, and that if we adapt accordingly, there may not just be a future for Muslims in Britain, but a very prosperous one. And that conceding, by the way, this is part of the issue. Conceding that we might need to adapt, that we may have gotten some things wrong, that we can't continue the way we are, is not the same as saying that there don't exist that there does not exist genuine bigotry out there. There obviously is, and there always will be. There will be a whole host of political actors who are jumping on the bandwagon or weaponizing or scapegoating or whatever. But again, the question remains, ultimately, we can't control people's thoughts. We must simply control our reactions. That's me.
Yes, Jacob.
My part, I just want to end with a note of hope, I suppose, because the whole question we just been discussing was framed in a rather, pessimistic, gloomy way. But I think the problems we're facing in Britain also could be a great opportunity, because even now, despite all these worries about losing certain freedoms or pressure being placed on Muslims, in many respects, Muslims in Britain have more freedoms, religious and political, than Muslims in most of the Muslim world. That's been the case for a long time. That's still the case. It's probably not going to stop being the case, even in quite a pessimistic scenario. So we have the luxury of being able to debate these things freely. We have the liberty and the privilege to be able to have this kind of discussion at what has been a really high intellectual level, engaging people in a really deep way. And I think out of this, we can try to build something that could be a model, not just for Britain and not just for the wider health of Britain, but to some extent for the Muslim Ummah, for Muslims as a whole. It could even be the case that out of this kind of adversity, we start building something that can inspire Muslims around the world. It's very often been the case that at the margins of the Islamic civilization, in places of strife and challenge, renewal has come. And so I think we should try to find the source of hope and optimism in our present challenges.
Oh no, thank you. And Jacob, maybe do you want to say just if you like just a line on like what can we all hope for from your work, like in the coming year, couple of years, few years? Well, what's your project? What are you trying to do?
Well, I'm a humble academic political theorist, so part of my project is to really articulate the kind of ideas we've been discussing in a more theoretical way, and hopefully to communicate them to the wider world too. And I'll continue to work with Pickthall House and the practical work we've been doing to try to actually bring Muslims and non-Muslim stakeholders together to solve our present challenges and work towards the good of the whole community and the whole country.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacob Williams, Mustafa Warsi. God bless you both. Really appreciate you doing this, especially at relatively short notice. Thanks to everybody who participated. I hope you found it engaging, probably provocative, but that's fine. It's all part of figuring it out, I suppose. For those of you who are live here on the webinar, there'll be an opportunity just for you to leave your feedback afterwards. Please keep expletives to yourself. Other than that, please feel share whatever you like. But yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, may we all be guided to a future that is one of flourishing and in the interest of all in a time which it's very easy to be pessimistic for a million different reasons. But yeah, onwards and upwards. But thank you all. Take care. Peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.